It is Tuesday, February the 2nd, 2021. This is the Distant Peasant Podcast, and I am your host, Jeff in Georgia. On today's show, a labor of love, banishing the work ethic. Yeah, today I want to tell you a story, not about a person or an event, but an idea. Maybe a ghost. Used to be you get a priest for an exorcism. I'm kind of picky about my theology, and there are no other priests around, so this preacher will have to do. But of course, before I get to all of that, just a brief reminder that this show, like all of these shows, is brought to you by listeners like you, folks who have gone to patreon.com/distantpeasant and become recurring donors for as little as $1 a month. Thank you to each and every one of my patrons, without whom this project would not be possible. I really appreciate it when people give money to the Patreon, because it helps me budget for the future. But if you want to give a one-time donation, there's a PayPal button at paypal.me/distantpeasant. You can always check out my Twitter at JeffHisDudeNess. Finally, there's a Twitch channel, twitch.tv/postpostrevolution. It is run by three gentlemen of the highest caliber. I am one of them. It's a great show. You see it live, maybe during the week sometimes, but the main show, where we talk news, politics, watch videos, engage with the chat, etc., Saturdays and Sunday nights. So check that out. That is twitch.tv/postpostrevolution. Working to make that a cool community space for people who enjoy talking about politics from the left. All right, that is enough plugging. Been working hard on this script for long enough. On with the show. I've struggled with how to begin to talk about the story of an idea, and not a person, but I have settled on this. A question. What precisely are you and I, or any of us here on Earth, to do? That is to say, we exist in the world, and I'll hear no talk of any 1999 films entitled The Matrix, thank you. So what ought we be doing with our time? I think the answer depends on who we are, when we are, where we are. So for the heck of it, let's just start within medieval European society, Christendom, where everyone inside the club more or less fit into the great chain of being. Your waking hours were defined by birth, and one's particular works, in the sense that the word appears in translation of St. Paul's epistles, were mostly defined by where one was at in the great chain. It is work, or labor, we might say, to rule a kingdom, to work a farm, to manage and minister a parish, or even to quietly contemplate the Lord in a monastery, and so on. But let's restrict ourselves to activity that grows an economy, causes capital to accumulate and concentrate, for these tendencies existed in pre-capitalist societies. Though the surplus value of the labor of all those peasants and serfs and servants did tend to concentrate wealth and specialize labor over time, there was no accompanying drive to maximize profit like we have today. Now sure, one could reinvest the profits of economic activity to generate more, if one were one of the lucky few to exist in a time and a place with sufficient infrastructure to give you access to markets to do so. But even so, it was no great matter for a king or a duke or a natural disaster or whatnot to simply take what you had, either in whole or part. And as for those nobles themselves, concentration in capital and land was limited by the feudal structure and competition within it, by the vagaries of inheritance, and by the Catholic Church, both politically and ideologically. It should be particularly appreciated that the writings we have from the Church at the time on the sins of avarice, usury, and the duty of charity were directed at the only literate audiences of the time, other clergy, and those with capital themselves, the noble class, and eventually the fledgling proto-bourgeois. Finally, medieval era Catholicism always contained within it a tension regarding the material world, a world which it sometimes regarded indifferently and sometimes with hostility, as evidenced in the rise over time of several ascetic movements across its territory. Now, don't get me wrong, the concentration of wealth in the hands of the few did continue to occur, but it was limited not just by material conditions, but ideological ones as well. Not insignificant amounts of family centers of capital were, in this or that generation, severely reduced by charitable action. Anyway, during this time, St. Paul's words in chapter 3, verse 10 of his second letter to the Thessalonians, quote, "He who does not work shall not eat," did not mean a maxim to work in and of itself, beyond what was needed to sustain one's existence, and did not exclude quiet contemplation, celebration, creativity, and worship as permissible efforts within the bounds of Christendom, even as the particulars were under some negotiation. However, there came a man who, like him or not, well, he was kind of the man for his time and place, in a sense. Martin Luther would develop and spread so many ideas that we named a whole damn religious sect after him, but specifically regarding notions of what people ought to be doing with their time, he thought somewhat differently than all that. He was really the guy we have to thank, or perhaps curse, for our idea of a calling, that is, a divinely ordained or today somehow meant for you life task that you can put yourself to. Mundane activity suddenly became sacred, and the idea that one could live acceptably to God only through the fulfillment of worldly obligations imposed upon the individual by that world was Luther's gift of advice. The way of the monk, of withdrawal from the concerns and experiences of the world, comes in for increasingly harsh criticism as Luther develops his thinking. It lacked both theological justification, and it was clearly the product of selfishness to him. But worldly labor, to weave cloth or tend fields or fish the sea or rule a kingdom, these were expressions of love, for we each work for one another under our proto-capitalist system, as I weave cloth for your nets, and you catch the fish for my meal, and what have you. But Luther's ethic, whatever his protestations of the Pope's Church, remained highly traditionalist. Life is short, and salvation available to all, of all walks of life. So what sense does it make to him to put weight on the form of occupation? The pursuit of material gain in excess of personal need was still seen as evidence of a lack of grace or salvation, even as Luther's increasing regard for the idea that productive labor under the watchful providence of the Lord was necessary for salvation, and it made such material gains inevitable. Still, figuring out one's calling was easy, whatever society told you was the case, through the circumstances of birth, and through the proper and providential authority that was present there. I have yet more dead crackers for us to get through, though, and the next has probably been anticipated by our more familiar listeners, John Calvin. John Calvin had a few more ideas, and spawned many sects just as Luther did, but undoubtedly his most famous doctrine has, at first glance, nothing to do with work ethic, predestination. Now, ideas regarding providence, that the world is under the watchful and benevolent will of the Lord, evolved into the idea that God, in his perfection, could not help but know the course of all reality from creation beyond apocalypse and unto infinity. And we people know clearly from the scriptures that some will be saved and others will not. So, combining these two facts, God knows from the beginning who shall reach heaven and who shall be condemned to hell. Now, this conclusion leads to a number of pretty troubling thoughts for the human mind, in my opinion. But while all that might be a little debatable, what isn't is that for these types of Christians, assuring one's salvation became an incredibly lonely enterprise. No sacraments could help you achieve it, nor any priest's advice. there was only your heart and God, whose way is revealed to you only through his scriptures, and your destiny always certain. Pilgrim's Progress, the most widely read book in all Puritan literature, specifically begins with Christian leaving his wife and family to begin his pilgrimage alone to the celestial city. They literally cling to him to try to stop him from leaving. And to what others in the world could one ever be closer to than one's family? Anyway, this lonely conception of the path to salvation inevitably leads to an intense psychological need for external worldly signs of grace. It is ironic that a theology so heavily focused on the inner life of the believer, so heavily disdainful of luxury and festival and whatnot, one that held the world should exist only for the glory of God, would produce believers so hungry for more mundane signs of grace, like material prosperity. But the idea of the calling also evolved with them, as labor in the service of impersonal social usefulness was seen to promote the glory of God, and all truly saved Christians would exhibit this behavior. Works did not bring salvation, but became indispensable as means of banishing fear of damnation, in mind first and then in deed. For as any old-line Calvinist could tell you, the Lord hath spoken on this. Idle hands are the devil's playground. And you can't just work at any sort of works, mind you. These works must not be in the service of the flesh, of pleasure and excess. You see, the will of God, and therefore of the universe that is his, is to work in service of your duty to worldly affairs, to sustain your own existence, and then turn your efforts towards laboring for the kingdom of heaven on earth. Perhaps nothing is so illustrative to people in demonstrating this tendency as the Calvinist attitude towards Christmas, banned as an excessive holiday, never mentioned in the scriptures and heavily laden with pagan influence and ungodly superstitions. Presbyterian Scotland first banned the celebration in 1583, and England under Cromwell did the same from 1647 to 1660, when the monarchy was restored. Boston's Puritans outlawed Christmas in 1659. When the British government took over the colony and the ban was repealed for 3 years, starting in 1686, the governor had to be protected by armed guards on his way to Christmas service. And it wasn't just Christmas, of course. Gambling, smoking in public, fancy clothing, and drinking to excess all were serious crimes in these communities. And just to live among the Puritans as a single man, one required special permission from the community unless they were a public officer or had at least one servant, presumably as an outward sign of God's favor. And now we come to an important intersection of a few ideas, which when taken together in a couple of hasty planks formed, give you something like the modern Protestant work ethic that we could see today. God has called you to labor in service of his kingdom, and that labor through Luther has become sacred, a calling, a divinely ordained place, and the developing economic system for you is here. Calvin takes things further still. Not only labor itself, but its fruits have become sacred, and the prosperity and capital accumulation that accompanies that labor a symbol of the favor of God, a sign that one was living right. Thirdly, though this next tendency has melted away quite a bit by today, it still persists, that for the individual person or family unit, capital's ability to find its way towards funding consumption rather than reinvestment is restricted. You see, charity had and has its place, though there was and is an ever a fear of indulging or enabling bad behavior of those who lack wealth because they aren't elect and lack virtue. They either will not or cannot do what others with wealth have done to bring themselves prosperity. Now, the religious overtones of this sort of thing have been subsumed, and this ethic's ability to restrict people's consumption habits has been severely limited in our age of excess, but all of these ideas still haunt us. For these Calvinists, Terror and dread over one's eternal fate is lonely and infinite, and those doubts are ever in need of suppression. Productive labor that results in a society's accumulation of capital became a way, eventually the way, to banish one's doubts, bringing with it the ability to afford ever more expensive indulgences that one must refrain from. Actually, this paradox, that this lifestyle of existentially compelled and socially productive labor inevitably leads to temptations to indulge in new worldly luxuries, is excellently summed up not by John Calvin, but John Wesley, the father of the Methodist denomination that yours truly was confirmed in as a boy. Quote, "I fear wherever riches have increased, the essence of religion has decreased in the same proportion. Therefore, I do not see how it is possible in the nature of things for any revival of true religion to continue long. For religion must necessarily produce both industry and frugality, and these cannot but produce riches. But as riches increase, so will pride, anger, and love of the world in all its branches. How then is it possible that Methodism, that is, a religion of the heart, though it flourishes now as a green bay tree, should continue in this state? For the Methodists, in every place, grow diligent and frugal. Consequently, they increase in goods. Hence, they proportionately increase in pride, in anger, in the desire of the flesh, the desire of the eyes, and the pride of life. So, although the form of religion remains, the spirit is swiftly vanishing away. Is there no way to prevent this continual decay of pure religion? We ought not to prevent people from being diligent and frugal. We must exhort all Christians to gain all they can and to save all they can. That is, in effect, to grow rich." End quote. So, what does one do with the resulting fruits of this new ideologically compelled labor if you can't spend it on anything fun? There's at least one more dead cracker that needs handling to get us to the next spot. I have talked of God and priests enough, so let's talk about someone totally different, and who barely needs much introduction, old Benjamin Franklin. And by old, I mean by the time the United States is finally formed all proper like, he was an old man, less a founding father than grandfather. He is one of the less objectionable set of Tier 1 names. To take a few examples, he initially owned and dealt in slaves, but became a moderate abolitionist by the 1750s. He made his initial fortune and fame as a printer and author. He has several legitimate scientific achievements and inventions to his credit, and he is responsible for early and critical support of that most real one of all real ones in that generation of American revolutionaries, Thomas Paine. Franklin was, at least, no pampered and hypocritical Southern aristocrat like Thomas Jefferson, nor was he a pompous and disdainfully fearful of popular will kind of guy like John Adams. Benjamin Franklin is well known for much, but before he really got into government, he achieved world fame as a writer and printer. Much of what he wrote specifically about virtue and life is considered today quaintly cliché, mostly harmless stuff. But Benjamin Franklin was himself the son of two very devout Puritans. He certainly didn't take their whole way of life with him forward into the future, but some things he never let go of. And in his writings, he sought explicitly to close this circle on the ethics terms and answer the question of what one is to do with the capital produced by this virtuous and spiritually compelled labor, if opportunities for charity and consumption are so limited, as well as marry the concepts of a virtuous life and virtuous credit score. In 1748, Benjamin Franklin wrote the following in an essay entitled Advice to a Young Tradesman, quote, "Remember that time is money. He that can earn 10 shillings a day by his labor, and goes abroad or sits idle one half of that day, though he spends but 6 pence during his diversion or idleness, ought not to reckon that the only expense. He has really spent, rather thrown away, 5 shillings besides. Remember that credit is money. If a man lets his money lie in my hands after it is due, he gives me interest, or so much as I can make of it during that time. This amounts to a considerable sum where a man has good and large credit, and makes good use of it. Remember that money is of the prolific generating nature. Money can beget money, and its offspring can beget more, and so on. 5 shillings turned is 6, turned again is 7 and 3 pence, and so on till it becomes 100 pounds. The more there is of it, the more it produces every turning, so that the profits rise quicker and quicker. He that kills a breeding sow destroys all her offspring to the 1,000th generation. He that murders a crown destroys all that it might have produced, even scores of pounds. Remember this saying, the good paymaster is lord of another man's purse. He that is known to pay punctually and exactly to the time he promises may at any time and on any occasion raise all the money his friends can spare. This is sometimes of great use. After industry and frugality, nothing contributes more to the raising of a young man in the world than punctuality and justice in all his dealings. Therefore, never keep borrowed money an hour beyond the time you promised, lest a disappointment shut up your friend's purse forever. The most trifling actions that affect a man's credit are to be regarded. The sound of your hammer at 5 in the morning or 8 at night, heard by a creditor, makes him easy 6 months longer. But if he sees you at a billiard table, or hears your voice at a tavern when you should be at work, he sends for his money the next day, demands it, before he can receive it in a lump. It shows besides that you are mindful of what you owe. It makes you appear a careful as well as an honest man, and that increases your credit. Beware of thinking all your own that you possess and of living accordingly. It is a mistake that many people who have credit fall into. To prevent this, keep an exact account for some time, both of your expenses and your income. If you take the pains at first to mention particulars, it will have this good effect. You will discover how wonderfully small, trifling expenses mount up to large sums, and will discern what might have been, and may for the future be saved, without occasioning any great inconvenience. For £6 a year, you may have the use of £100, provided you are a man of known prudence and honesty. He that spends a groat a day idly spends idly above £6 a year, which is the price for the use of £100. He that wastes idly a groat's worth of his time per day, one day with another, wastes the privilege of using £100 each day. He that idly loses 5 shillings worth of time loses 5 shillings, and might as prudently throw 5 shillings into the sea. He that loses 5 shillings not only loses that sum, but all the advantage that might be made by turning it in dealing, which by the time that a young man becomes old will amount to a considerable sum of money. End quote. At the time of its writing, this popular and practical type of outlook had lost its religious trappings, certainly. But it still contains within it more than just advice on how to get by in the world. There is some moral language here. Franklin speaks of wasted time at billiard tables and taverns as opposed to the careful, mindful honesty of the workers seen or heard at labor. To pay one's debts according to agreement is not just punctuality, but justice. Even to idle about and indulge in nothing much at all is disdainful, since one could be working. This is not just wastefulness, but the murder of money. God and the salvation of the soul are nowhere to be seen, replaced with the salvation of the self through frugality and industry. But more critically, it answers the question of the end to what shall we do with the wealth that accumulates to us through labor. We shall turn it into more wealth. With the development of capitalism comes investment opportunities in both one's own enterprises and in others. And it isn't just what you yourself might be able to save for such opportunities to expand economic production. For those who follow the path of this virtuousness, money might be pooled through social trust, and when returned with interest, build yet more trust. As an aside, this is an ethic of the tradesman of specialized laborers, but also of that class of people who tend to buy into the ideological tenets of capitalist society the most, self-interested investors. So here we have, at least according to Marxist Jeffist thought, our completed Protestant work ethic in America. Luther has summed up the idea that to work at something worldly but socially productive is a divine calling that one should submit to. Calvin has given us the grim idea that most are damned, and God hath created them that way, and made the calling and its resulting fruits not a submission but a compulsion. Both together encourage an asceticism that limited consumption, and a theology that limited humanist charity. And we have seen how John Wesley lamented the fact that with a revival of this ethic came wealth, which attached people to the world through rising standards of living and new luxuries, who then required a new revival, etc. Benjamin Franklin, the world's first really famous American, represents the secularization of this ethic over time, and tells us through specific and long-winded examples the ends to which all this wealth is to be put. The generation and concentration of more capital. This is both for virtue and practicality's sake, so that in old age one will have something left for themselves, and inevitably leads to the conclusion that those for whom things don't work out so finely lack virtue. To paraphrase Max Weber, those earlier Protestant communities wanted to work in a calling, but by Franklin's day, it was becoming more and more compulsory. We should probably talk about Max Weber, whom I'll admit I've been cribbing from this whole time. He was more or less the first guy to think of the Protestant work ethic and the spirit of capitalism, as he put it, as a thing, in his essay of the same name, as well as his other works expanding on these ideas, as they've always been somewhat controversial, at least since being translated into English around 1930, some 25 years after the Protestant work ethic and the spirit of capitalism was written. I have left aside much of what he discusses, but he has come in for a few criticisms over the years for overemphasizing the development of this ethic as a cause or accelerant in the development of capitalism. Some over the years have pointed out that the material conditions for capitalism in Europe first really appeared in Renaissance-era Italy, while others have pointed out that Calvinist Scotland failed to quickly develop a capitalist economy despite its new faith. Some others have tried to historically correlate Protestantism with economic growth on continental Europe, with no luck. And it is this sort of thing one inevitably encounters when searching for information on what the Protestant work ethic is and whether or not it is quote-unquote real. Weber, for his part, notes in the closing of his essay that, quote, "It is, of course, not my aim to substitute for a one-sided materialistic cause an equally one-sided spiritualistic causal interpretation of culture and history. Each is equally possible, but each, if it does not serve as the preparation, but as the conclusion of an investigation, accomplishes equally little in the interest of historical truth." End quote. Weber was not a Marxist, though he was influenced by Marx, and his thesis that this ethic, as he defined it, influenced the development of modern capitalism should, I think, be taken as an attempt at inquiry, and not as a crude choice between material conditions versus ideology. What's more, the idea that the Protestant work ethic is fake isn't exactly true, even if it is true that the Protestants and Catholics of Europe don't seem to have experienced different rates of capitalist development. The idea of a calling, specialized work one is meant to do in order to enjoy a peaceful existence in this life and perhaps the next, and of the virtues of thrift and productive work for their own sakes, of careful frugality, of the shunning of spontaneity, charity, and luxury, all so that one may enjoy an old age supported by oneself, these ideas are all still with us. Now, to be blunt, I am less concerned today with numbers than vibes, though I agree with the good Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., that the idea that the Protestant work ethic of white Europe is responsible for the material prosperity and development of capitalist America is nonsense, and that it was really slavery and genocide that were far more responsible for that. I just think plenty of people then and now truly believe in the nonsense to some consequence. Anyway, I was speaking of vibes, and the vibes are still strong and still with us. Let's take some extreme examples. Consider the prosperity theology that's grown up in America. Names like Kenneth Copeland, Oral Roberts, Joel Osteen. No one else has purely carried into the future like them the idea that material prosperity is a blessing from God. As these churches, and for those as yet unblessed, they demand donations to his church in exchange for blessings. They hold courses coupling a sprinkling of decentish advice on financial responsibility with advice to purchase expensive possessions as a sign of faith in God and his blessings. Their social programs are centered around releasing people from a welfare mentality in order to bring them the divine prosperity that occurs when they submit to labor on behalf of God's kingdom on earth. Oddly enough, as an aside, the Prime Minister of Australia currently, and the leader of its Liberal Party, Scott Morrison, is a member of a church that teaches prosperity theology and is an absolute freak. Not all Protestant churches in America get quite so crass with things. While many tend to hedge their theological claims of the one-to-one relationship on average with material wealth and divine favor, nearly all embrace the ethic on some questions of asceticism. And I am not referring, this time at least, to the ascetic quality of labor, but to the abstention of material goods, specifically mood or mind-enhancing drugs of any kind. Now, I am no doctor or psychologist or anything, so I will not try to get into the biological and social sciences surrounding what humans know about this sort of thing. But alcoholism and other types of addiction are topics many an American Protestant church is very into. And with few exceptions, their faith-based courses inevitably lead to failure for their participants' inability to find the will to follow their one tangible piece of advice: don't do it. I don't mean to sound overly harsh, but I am of the opinion that this way of thinking doesn't just result in failure, but requires it. Everyone who doesn't make it into recovery is responsible for their own failure to live right. To put it secularly, this is just as true for addicts as it is for poor people from these adherents of the ethics point of view. It isn't just churches this ethic still haunts. A quick search of the internet for financial advice turns up several tips where the ethic shines bright. An ethic that has long ceased to be confirmed by reality, and so can sound pretty ridiculous. There are tips that specifically encourage a mindset that conforms to the ethic, quote, learn how to savor. Savoring means appreciating what you have now, instead of trying to get happy by acquiring more things. Quote, banish toxic money thoughts. Hello, self-fulfilling prophecy. If you psych yourself out before you even get started, I'll never pay off debt, then you're setting yourself up to fail. So don't be a fatalist and switch to a more positive mantra. Or, quote, draft a financial vision board. You need motivation to start adopting better money habits. And if you craft a vision board, it can help remind you to stay on track with your financial goals. But there are also tips about discouraging consumption. Quote, evaluate purchases by cost per use. Spend on the real you, not the imaginary you. As well as tips for how to earn more, such as they are. When negotiating a salary, get the company to name figures first. And also tips on how to maintain good and virtuous credit. Don't ever co-sign a loan. Multiple generations of deindustrialization, financialization, stagnant wages, and rapidly increasing wealth inequality, and still the ethic is taught. Even as it becomes less and less true for more and more people that prosperity follows from this virtue, humans ought to live to work, not work to live, according to the ethic. To paraphrase Weber again, some of the earliest Calvinists, those so concerned with the inner life, thought the care for worldly goods should lie upon the shoulders of the saint like a light cloak, which can be thrown aside at any moment. But fate decreed that the cloak should become an iron cage, And I would add that less and less do we even have, broadly speaking, those material goods to show for all this. There is only the ethic. And even during the most current economic crisis and pandemic, our politics has focused on the ethic. Whether in distributing relief checks, we hurt the ethic. Whether day traders on Reddit with checks threaten the ethic. And of course, unemployment compensation, whether it destroys the ethic. To take a few examples. Most darkly to me is when fealty to this silly, outdated ethic damages deep personal relationships. As misery spreads in America, the ethic demands that those who suffer must often suffer further, as their inability to obtain, say, a decent income isn't considered an unfortunate effect of living under a late capitalist system, experiencing deeper and more frequent crises, or just more plainly bad times for America. It's instead considered a personal failing of the victims, and the more one's efforts don't bring them blessings, the less they count. The conclusion is not infrequently reached by people that the problem for them is a lack of ethic, and that what these people really need is less material help, not more. Precisely at a time when people are falling into poverty faster than ever before. I've talked plenty about what the ethic is, according to me at least, where it came from, where it persists. It is important to note that beliefs and ideologies never arise without reason. And even when they seem contradictory or irrational, they're never totally useless. They always outlive their usefulness, of course. And I think that outliving is one component of the synthesis of new beliefs and ideologies, after all. But I think the reason the ethic developed and took hold among some people at some times is because it really did work for them, at least part of the time. It was possible for a time, due to material conditions and not belief, mind you, for many of these Protestant communities to work hard and turn money into yet more money, to make labor more productive and specialized, and to encourage the development of a global system of trade and eventually commodities markets. I don't want to underemphasize just how far from universal these faith communities' ideologies were. These were communities dedicated to prohibiting both the residence and equal participation of anyone who didn't fit their structure by race, creed, sex, gender, and many, many, many more categories. But for them and some of their descendants, the ethic served its purposes, at least for a time, close enough for the fudging. Forgive me for putting it crudely, but for a long time after initial waves of non-indigenous disease helped kick off a great deal of depopulation in America, there was so much damn free land that the prosperity really did seem endless under this system. But that was long ago for us now. And even for the honkies and crackers of America, that prosperity is falling away. It hasn't been easy exactly to find the words to lay out what the ethic was and is, and how it turns people's gaze ever inward and never upward, and how it persists in the culture with an almost ironically comical fastness, given how disconnected from lived experience its teachings are. But it has been perhaps easier than to try to craft and spread a new ethic, assuming that people can be said to be self-consciously responsible for ideology. Just as it's kind of easier to tear down a house than to build one. What's more, due to my problematic commitment to secularism, I have no scriptures to appeal to, and no gods to supplicate to for any aid. There is only me and the world, and what I think I know, and what I think I can convey through the symbol of language. But at base we must believe in ourselves enough to try a little, and place a worthy brick upon the foundation of a new ethic that might bind humanity together in ever greater circles. Luther and Calvin's conceptions of a calling, that is, a divinely ordained life task, this is a worthy starting point. I will be sermonizing my pure opinion at this point, but the truth is that many types of labor ought be considered divine, I think, in the sense that they fulfill human needs and result in flourishment, pleasure, and happiness among humanity, and humanity possesses within it something special or divine, depending on the language one prefers. To produce and deliver food and medicine, computers, houses, clothing, energy, even moderately entertaining and informative historical podcasts, all of this and much, much more might be considered divine labor if we consider humanity itself divine. Calvin and Luther were not the first people nor the last to realize that because of the complexity of our society and the division of labor, we all do work for one another, and we shouldn't put this aside. This labor is not usually fun or enjoyable, of course, which is why the compulsory iron cage of the original ethic exists, but a new ethic would recommend, in the short term at least, that humanity both spread the pain more evenly and value the labor more highly. That is, pay people more, not just think of them more fondly. I don't mean to sound too sentimental, but if we all really loved one another, then all such labor could be labor of love. Who knows? Such an idea, if it really took off, this new ethic might result in many other types of quote-unquote labor that are useless or worse being valued by our society less highly. Say, holding and trading assets, running private health insurance companies, or building endless devices for an imperial war machine designed to hold the world in thrall to the compulsion to turn money into yet more money. Just to take a few examples. But most of all, I would hope such a new ethic would banish the guilt, blame, and depression so many people currently feel. They are endlessly admonished for taking on too much debt. It's a pity they didn't finish school, or they studied the wrong major in school. They should have moved away or not moved away, not had children, worked harder, saved more, spent less, and on and on. Never realizing that it is not we who are increasingly failures, but that the system is increasingly failing us. It's true that some people are able to convince themselves intellectually not to be so damn hard on themselves, but some aren't. They may spend their days in shame and misery, instead of understanding that they are trapped by the iron cage they did not forge. Or if they're prosperous enough themselves, they may force that shame and misery onto all those who aren't prosperous, up to and including their own blood. Whereas the truth is that we all ought to work for each other and nothing else. Specifically, its maxim to turn wealth into yet more wealth. So to answer my original question, what precisely are you and I and any of us here on earth to do? Twofold. Sometimes we work to take care of each other, and other times, mostly, we do whatever we like. Thank you for listening. I hope that you enjoyed that. I know it's a little different than some of the things that I normally like to talk about. I don't want to get too far afield of this, but I really do believe that in a country with so much religion in it as America, both today and in the past, that, a new mindset that will allow a more socialist and caring society to grow up will have some religious trappings to it. That's just all there is to it. And so I'm not trying to start a cult over here, but I think this stuff is worth looking into. Anyway, to support the show, don't forget patreon.com/distantpeasant. Become a recurring donor for as little as $1 a month. Twitch.tv/postrevolution is a real Twitch channel with real cool guys on it. You can check out my Twitter at JeffIsDoingThis. The PayPal button is paypal.me/distantpeasant. You can find links to all this at distantpeasant.com. I will see you next time.